Do you ever find yourself mindlessly scrolling Amazon when you're in a bad mood, hoping that it will make you feel better? This is called retail therapy, and it's a huge reason that so many people are overspending and unhappy in their lives. If you're new here, my name is Charles, and I'm a savings accountability coach in my spare time. And through working with almost 100 people one-on-one at this point, I've realized just how dangerous retail therapy can be. So I'm hoping that this video will help you overcome it. And this idea of retail as therapy is really a relatively new concept. And it all started with the normalization of the 40-year career. Society, at least in the Western world, has had enough for many decades now. We have enough food to feed everyone, and we have enough housing for everyone. Here in the US, we could absolutely provide a safe and comfortable lifestyle for everybody in the nation. This only occurred once we hit the Industrial Revolution. Before then, people really did have to work in order to have enough to survive. And in some cases, people did not have enough to survive. So before the Industrial Revolution, people really did have to work their entire lives because they were truly providing a livelihood for themselves. But with the Industrial Revolution, as we began to produce much more, even more than we needed, then this idea of working your entire life became somewhat optional. This is really the first time in human history that a large percentage of the population could amass resources, money, that they could use to support their lifestyle for the rest of their lives. Our labor became so efficient that working until 60 wasn't the only option. But this is not what actually happened. Even though people could build up wealth, save that money, invest that money, and become financially free, nothing really changed. People continued to work their entire lives. One of the reasons that this happened is because the government was taking a larger role in supporting its citizens, and they began to put in incentives to encourage people to work longer. For example, the introduction of Social Security made it possible for people to start drawing monthly checks once they reached a certain age. But beyond these government programs, this was also an incentive from the corporate world, because at this time, pensions were much more popular. And pensions provided a huge percentage of somebody's income, but only if they worked a very long time at the same company. This infrastructure started to be built around the time of the Industrial Revolution, and it made it so that there was a lot of incentive to keep working a standard career. And there was so much incentive that this became the normal. So many people were doing it that very few people even considered that there was an alternative. But even so, there is still a huge amount of diversity in how much income somebody makes. Some people are going to be on a much lower end of that. Other people will have higher incomes. So if people only bought the things that they needed to survive, then the people who had higher than average incomes would find themselves with much more wealth than other people. And eventually, they would probably realize that they didn't have to wait until their 60s in order to be financially free. But this never happened, because at the same time that a 40-year career was being normalized, corporations also realized that they could give people another path to spend their money. And this is what led to the rise of shopping as entertainment. Because even as we could start to afford everything that we needed to survive, we had enough as a society, these corporations also realized that something that people feel like they never have enough of is status. Our desire for status is never ending, and even better, it creates a reinforcing loop, because status is only imparted by things that only you have, or at least that only a few people have. So as soon as everybody around you owns the same things, then those objects no longer give status. I'll give you an example of this. Think of a car. At this time, early in the 1900s, around the mid-1900s, more and more people were owning a vehicle. For a little while, this was a huge status symbol because only a few people could afford a vehicle. But as more and more people owned vehicles, these stopped being a status symbol. Once everybody in your neighborhood owns a vehicle, then the only way for your vehicle to give you status is to have a nicer, even more expensive vehicle that other people can't afford. This is the absolute dream for a corporation because it gives them a very natural market to not just sell somebody once, but to continue to sell people more and more expensive things. This is truly a never-ending cycle, and it's why decades later, even though we have far more wealth than we ever have at any point in human history, most people still feel like they don't have enough stuff. We all all own things which couldn't have even been fathomed 50 years ago. But we don't compare ourselves to our ancestors 50 years ago, we compare ourselves to the people around us. So instead of becoming content with having enough for survival, corporations created a market for consumerism that had absolutely no limit. And to make sure that we continue to invest all of our extra resources into these markets, these corporations worked very hard to make sure that spending money was as attractive, as easy, and as addictive as possible. To make spending money attractive, they began to associate products which we don't need with celebrities and with athletes and with entrepreneurs. In other words, these corporations invented demand. There's already natural demand for things that we need for survival. You don't need to sell somebody clean drinking water. You don't really need to sell somebody nutritious food. These are things that people already know they need and they're going to get no matter what. But as people began to have excess income after the Industrial Revolution, these companies needed to convince people that they needed something which they didn't really actually need. And they also made it as easy as possible to give up your money, so it didn't feel like a huge loss when you did trade the money that you had for these things which you didn't really need. And there have been so many inventions to make it easier to spend your money. Credit cards are a great example because you don't even feel the loss of your money for another 30 days or so until you're actually hit with the bill for the things that you're buying. Online shopping has also made this extremely easy where you can spend your money with just a single click from the comfort of your own home. And financing has made it easier and easier for people to make huge purchases, which really they might not be able to afford, but they can afford the monthly payment. And after you buy, these corporations want to make it as addictive as possible to continue to spend your money so that you don't just spend your money once, but you continue to spend your money with them. Personalized advertisements and recurring memberships are both ways to hook people so that they continue to spend money, which they wouldn't have otherwise. But maybe the most dangerous part of it is that these companies have worked very hard to make sure that everybody experiences a dopamine rush after making a purchase. So all of this makes spending money feel like a natural and automatic response to feeling stress. And the problem is that it actually works. It works really well. Many people do feel a huge rush of dopamine after shopping. This does, temporarily at least, make them feel much better. And that is all that is needed to build a positive association and positive feedback to make people want to spend money again and remember that when they feel bad and they spend their money, they feel better. Of course, this high fades and the dopamine rush goes away. But by the time that buyer's remorse kicks in, it's usually too late because this pairing of spend money and feel better has already been created. And once spending is a habit, then you do it unthinkingly. So if your automatic response to being stressed is opening Amazon, then they have already won. So it is these two megatrends which have led to this concept of retail therapy in the modern world. As we began to have enough, government and corporations started to build incentives to work at least 40 years, even though people really didn't have to. And at the same time, this idea of spending as entertainment gave us another option for us to spend our money. This has become so ingrained and normalized in our culture that many people don't even consider that there is an alternative. And people don't even realize that retail therapy has a cost. But it does. Retail therapy has a huge cost. At least the last I checked, around 50% of high income earners, so people earning 6 figures or more per year, were still living paycheck to paycheck. And this means that a disruption to their lives could put them into debt, disrupt their lifestyle, and force them to make rapid changes unexpectedly. And this situation is even more dire for people with medium or low incomes who don't even have as much buffer or as much room to change their lifestyle when an unexpected event occurs. And this problem is compounded by the rapidly changing nature of almost every industry, because technology is disrupting everything. This means far more people will have an unexpected change to their jobs, which they're not planning for now. Because for the past few decades, most jobs have been relatively stable, but that may be changing. But our culture of spending almost everything we have and working until our 60s, that is really not changing. It's still just as normal, maybe even more normal, to spend around 90% of what you make. And with credit cards and this idea of buy now, pay later becoming more and more popular, I don't think that this is going to change. But what it will do is put far more people in an even more dangerous financial position. But no matter what happens, society will still expect you to spend almost everything you have. And that's because it's the corporations which get to shape our culture. The radio and television and social media is all managed by massive corporations which really only make money if you decide to buy something. So even here on YouTube, where I help people spend less money and spend all of my time talking about the benefits of frugality and how much this can change your life and how quickly people can build wealth, even here, I make money and YouTube makes money because of ads played on my videos. The reason that YouTube gives me this free platform where I can upload videos and share them with the world is because they know that they will make money off of channels like mine. And YouTube makes a lot of money from playing ads. And companies are still buying those ad slots. So presumably the ads played on this channel are effective. So I think this is why overspending and retail therapy are so normalized, because it is good for the corporations and they want nothing more than to make that feel normal. So I was looking at the data relatively recently, and the average single person in the US spends well over 90% of their take-home pay every year. The average couple and the average family doesn't spend quite as high of a percentage, but those are still around 85% spending rate, which means they only save around 15% of their take-home pay. But that's just the median person. So I wanted a little more of an understanding of how this changes on different extremes. Do people who earn much higher than average incomes save way more? And the bad news is they really don't. Even at very high incomes, most people still spend the vast majority of their income. But what really shocked me is that when I looked at the data, the bottom 50% of people all spend more money than they make every year. That means that 50% of people, that is hundreds of millions of people, go into more debt every single year or rely on other people to help pay them their bills. And this is extraordinarily scary to me because it's easy to get lost in the statistics when talking about millions and millions of people, but the real cost of retail therapy is a human cost. And I know this cost very well because when I was growing up, I didn't realize that there were other options. So until I learned about money, I was actually very depressed. I was very concerned that I would spend my entire life just trapped in a cubicle, a windowless office, doing something that I didn't care at all about. And that just felt like such a meaningless existence. Now, there's nothing wrong with it, and if that's how you're spending your life, that's totally fine. I hope you are enjoying it. I'm just saying that for me, that was not the right fit. But even for people who are on track for a traditional career, what I found with most of the people I work with is that they go many years, several decades usually, into their careers before realizing that they're really not building the wealth for the financial freedom that they expect when they reach retirement age. Because so many companies want you to think that saving money is something that you do later, that you'll make more money, it'll be easier, don't worry about it, just wait until you're later in your career. And in the short term, there are so many messages encouraging you to spend your money. And in the day-to-day time frame, it often does feel good to spend money. Give yourself a break, pay for a vacation, or go shopping on the weekends just to feel like all of your work matters. It is much harder for most people to take a look up and see if they're really going in the direction that they want to go. But what many people find when they do that is that they're decades into their careers and they really have almost nothing to show for it. And this is why so many people are anxious about retirement, because they know they're really not doing the things they need to do in order to put themselves in a good financial position. It's just so much easier to keep your head down and focus on just getting through the day. So in the short run, retail therapy is an effective drug for tuning out the world's bigger problems and trying to enjoy life when you can. But in the long term, retail therapy is a distraction, and it pulls your attention away from the things that actually give people more long-term fulfillment and purpose. A company can't sell you purpose, but they can sell you something which gives you a dopamine rush. The issue is that that is not a sustainable way to feel long-term joy over the course of your life. And plus, since it involves spending so much money, it's very self-destructive. And this is actually why I became a much happier person after I started learning about money. Because one, I had way less stress because I finally felt confident and comfortable about my plan for reaching financial freedom. But also, what's maybe even more important is that it made me focus on the stuff that actually mattered to me. Because up until the point that I learned about the financial independence movement and set my goals on reaching financial freedom, I always assumed that my happiness would come from my material success. I thought I needed to live in a really nice place and drive a fast car, be able to go on vacations whenever I wanted. I thought those were the things that would bring me joy. So I thought I had to have a ton of money to experience a joyous life. But when I realized that the joy of owning all of those things would fade just as fast as everything else I had ever bought, and I realized that that would not give me lasting joy, then I started focusing and paying attention to what actually did bring me joy, and what actually did make me feel fulfilled and make me want to jump out of bed in the morning, excited to live life. This completely changed my priorities, and it's a huge reason I'm able to save around 80% of my income every year while being a much happier person. Because even though I spend way less than the average person, I'm way more content with what I have than the average person. But look, when I first learned about all of this money stuff, it all seemed so obvious. Everything started to click, it all made sense to me. But the fact that so few people even consider it as an option and realize that there's not just one way to live life is a testament to the power of our consumerist culture. Because the spending culture in this part of the world wants you to believe that retail therapy is effective. They want you to think that if you spend money, you will be happier. There are CEOs who are dancing in the boardroom every time they see somebody say that they did some retail therapy over the weekend. That is what they want. But that is not what's best for you. To me, my happiness and my money are completely separate. The only way that they're connected is that by having money, I feel a lot less stress and a lot more confidence in my life. So having my money saved gives me joy. Spending my money does not give me joy. And I've become a much, much wealthier and much happier person when I separated these two things in my mind. So I'm hoping that I can pass that on and shift the culture and shift what is normal, at least for a small group of people. And this is actually a really big reason that I created my free community, the Savers Circle. Because my hope for this little free community is that collectively we can create our own normal. So if you struggle with overspending, or if you just sort of feel lonely on your journey towards your financial goals, then I think you'll find it immensely valuable. It opens on October 1st, and if you'd like to be a founding member, then there's a link in the description, or you can scan this QR code. But look, I've talked a lot about the dangers of retail therapy, but what I haven't talked about is what to do instead. And one of the best ways to break this idea of retail therapy, where you're spending money to try to get joy, is to completely flip it around. Instead, you should feel joy by saving money. And one of the best ways to do that is using challenges. If you want to see what that looks like, I made a whole video. It's a documentary of my life for a month where I was going through a very ambitious challenge to keep my expenses under a very low threshold. It was one of the hardest videos that I have ever made, but I'm really proud of it. So if you haven't seen it yet, I'll link it right here, and hopefully you like it as much as I do.